I met a man once. Yeah, I know. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yep, I have. I met a man. I was in a pub. That's where they are. And I was sitting there, and he had a powerful name. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard a powerful name in the wild, but this guy had a name so powerful that when he said it, everyone who heard it stopped what they were doing and just turned around. And this guy walks up to me, 70 years old, taps me on the shoulder and goes, "G'day, mate. The name's Jungle." I know. I was like, ooh, what a powerful name. And I was like, dude, if you wrote an autobiography to be called The Jungle Book, pick up the pen. And I was like, I got to know, mate, why do they call you Jungle? And he got so excited. He's like, why do they call me Jungle? There's only 2 reasons why anyone would ever be called Jungle, mate. And I was like, God, I'd love to know them. And he was like, they've either fought in the Vietnam War or they've got really hairy balls. And both of those apply to me, mate. And instantly I was in awe of this man. I've never fought in a war or hit puberty, so I was like, this man's a weapon. I invited him to sit at our table because I've always been very fascinated with war ever since I was a kid. And we ended up going pint for 5 hours on a Tuesday night, and he's sharing some of the craziest stories I've ever heard about the war. And at the end, he tells me one story that I'll never forget. Jungle had a best friend named Jim. Jungle Jim. And I was like, ooh, I like that. And before they went to war, they made a pact with each other that they wouldn't go home from Vietnam without the other, which is very sweet. They went off to war. A few months in, Jim got sent out on a mission to fix a wire just outside their base, which was surrounded by enemies, the Viet Cong, who they were fighting. And they're all peering over the bunker, watching Jim crawl out. He gets out to the wire and his arm snaps a branch. It makes a really loud noise, and they hear talking in the tree line, and it's the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong threw a grenade over to where they heard the noise, and Jungle very graphically described watching his best friend's leg get completely blown off and land 10 meters away on the other side of the battlefield. And I was sitting there at the pub in shock and in disbelief, and Jungle just goes, so at this point I was thinking, fuck. Rough start? And I was like, oh, yeah. He goes, but here's the thing about my best mate, Jim. He's a tough bugger. I knew that grenade wouldn't have fazed him. Now, I don't know Jim, but I'm fairly confident that if you got your entire leg blown off and you were sitting there in the mud bleeding out with one less limb than you just had, you wouldn't be like, I'm relatively unfazed by this. But again, I don't know Jim. And Jungle goes, trust me, mate, he survived much worse. And I was like, that is objectively not true. And straight away, Jungle walked up to his superior officers. He explained the situation about the pact and that he wasn't gone home from Vietnam without Jim. And he suggested a rescue mission, and they pretty much told him, no way. They were like, no one could survive that. Even if he did, he'd be bleeding out. We're sorry, Jungle. No one's to go out there. That's an order. And I went, what do you do? Well, like, what'd you do? And he goes, well, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I didn't at least try and save my best friend's life. So he goes, I decided to go out there against orders by myself. And he goes, before I left the trench, I thought to myself one thing. I thought, Jungle, you're not coming back with 75% of Jim. So I went for the leg first, mate. And I was like, why? It's not a finger. You can't put it on ice. He's like, I know that now. He goes, it was the 60s, it was a different time. And he commander crawls out by himself, gets the leg, and he goes, mate, legs are surprisingly heavy. And I was like, mate, imagine Kim Jong-un's. Be grateful. And he made his way across to Jim with the leg, and he gets halfway and he does the same thing, snaps a branch, makes a really loud noise, and a bloke from the Viet Cong popped out of a tunnel and shot at Jungle from about 20 meters away. And he goes, but I'm smart, mate, so I ducked. I was like, what a fucking genius. You're quite the problem solver, aren't you, Jungle? And he goes, it nicked me right here. And he pulls up his hairline. This man doesn't have a scar. This man has a dent in the side of his face. And I was like, oh, like it's a panel beating job. And I was like, you got shot in the head. And he goes, no, mate, it nicked me. And I was like, Jungle, you definitely got shot in the head. And he goes, no, mate, it nicked me. And I was like, that's so hot. And I interrupted him straight away. I just straight up said, I was like, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. And he goes, oh, why would you say that? And I was like, because you risked your own life to try and save your best friends without even thinking twice. And he goes, oh, I like to think everyone would do that for their best friend. I was like, you don't know me very well. If my best friend in the world was out there and I was like, are we going to go on a rescue mission? And they were like, no one could survive that. I'd be like, yeah, he's a weak dog, fuck him. But Jungle did. And he made his way over towards Jim, and sure enough, Jungle was right. He was still alive, barely conscious, but still breathing and still with it. And I was like, how'd you get him back? And he goes, well, it seemed too far away, so I did it bit by bit. They'd shoot. I'm smart, so I ducked. Then they'd reload, and as they'd reload, I'd drag Jim and then back for the leg. Drag Jim, back for the leg. And I'm sitting there like, oh my God, ditch the leg. You know when someone's telling a story and you're like, you're doing it all wrong? He goes, what kind of a friend would I be if I left a quarter of Jim in Vietnam? 75% is a pass in high school, mate. It's a great result. Just take the win. And he goes, it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And I was like, I can't even imagine. You know, imagine that. You're being shot at. You're in the mud. You're getting rained on. You know, in my head, I'm like, being shot at. I'm like, oh, it's raining. No, that's unfortunate. And he goes, oh, no. Mate, it wasn't tough because of those reasons. It was tough because I was just laughing so much the whole time. And I start to think, I think Jungle might be a psychopath. And then he goes, no, I didn't explain this earlier. Not only is Jim a tough bugger, but he's also got a great sense of humour, mate. He goes, even in his darkest moments, he'd always make me laugh like no one else ever could. I was like, oh my God, that's so sweet. What did he say? And he goes, we got halfway back, and he said that they got behind this log, and that like their boys started giving them cover fire, so the Viet Cong stopped shooting, and Jim was in his arms, Jungle was catching his breath, and Jim looks up at him and goes, Jungle, if we make it out of this alive, we're going to go to the pub. Jungle's like, why? And he goes, because then we can both be fucking legless, brother. I had it in the shackers, but still, you know. I like to imagine he was just that unfazed. So good. And I got really invested in the story, so I just was like, so what happened? Did you make it back? And he started to get a bit emotional, and he's like, oh, yeah, on the way back, Jim got shot. And I was like, oh my God. And he goes, in his bad leg, fucking idiots. It's like, they got him in the stump, mate, and Jim let him know about it too. And I was like, what do you mean? He heckled the enemy. He's like, yeah, pretty much. Which is so Australian. Not only were we fighting them physically, but just verbally as well. I like to imagine Jim was trying to come up with a sweet insult, and he's like, wait. Pick a colour. And you just hear from the tree line, blue. And he's like, nice shot, fuckhead. Get us out of here, Jungle, let's go. And I got really fixated on the getting shot thing. I don't know why. I had a few drinks, and Jungle kept trying to move on with the story, and I was like, oh, you must have been in so much pain because of the bullet. And he goes, yeah, he was in a lot of pain. I was like, no, because the bullet, I can't even imagine getting shot. I was like, I think I'd cry if I got shot. And Jungle goes, you would definitely cry if you got shot. And I was like, yeah. And I wouldn't let him move on. I was like, so much pain. He goes, mate, he took a grenade. I'm pretty sure he can take a fucking bullet. And I was like, oh, yeah. You probably know what a scaffy is too. And towards the end of the story, Jungle started to get a bit emotional, and he explained that they got Jim back to the trench. They rushed him off to the med bay, and he started to tear up. And I was like, I'm so sorry, you don't have to keep talking about this. It must be really hard. And he's like, no, I actually don't mind talking about it. He just said that he was getting emotional because he'd only processed this for the first time a couple of weeks before we met. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, what happened a couple of weeks ago? And he goes, oh, well, Jim ended up going home from the war. He had kids. You know, he has grandkids, and a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to walk Jim's grandkids to school, to help him walk his grandkids to school for the very first time, because, you know, Jim's not very good at walking anymore. An absolute low blow there from Jungle, but I did giggle a bit. And he goes, as we dropped Jim's granddaughter off to school, she looked back at us and smiled, and I will admit, mate, I shed one tear, and I thought, good. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? And he goes, oh, well, in that moment, as she smiled, I realised that I'd played a minor role in that, in the sense that I'd saved her grandfather's life. So I processed that with one tear and thought, good. And in that moment, I realised I was watching a 70-year-old man describe his first ever emotion. This guy's repressed this for 50 years, and all it took was a smiling child with a big backpack, and he's like, fuck, one tear, good, like a man. He'll never think about it again. And while I was slightly amused by that, I did realise in that moment as well, it was a bit sad. I kind of realised that no one ever told Jungle how incredible this story was, just by the way he was downplaying it. And I knew it wasn't my place, and I was like, I think I got to say, I was like, Jungle, that's the most honourable thing a human being can do, is risk your own life to save another person's and get shot in the head while doing it. And he goes, mate, it nicked me. I was like, it doesn't matter. Jim's family and friends and Jim must be eternally grateful for you. You should be incredibly proud of yourself. And he stood up out of his chair and he was like, oh, no one's ever said that to me before. And he gave me a really big hug. And then I started to get emotional. And now it's just two guys just crying in the pub. And then we sit back down into our chairs and it's completely silent. I didn't know what to say. And Jungle just goes, I've been talking about myself a lot tonight, mate. What do you do? And I was like, oh, I'm a comedian? And I thought he wasn't going to respect me. He goes, a comedian? Mate, there is no one I respect more than stand-up comedians. I was like, are you sure? He goes, yeah, mate, I think you have the bravest job in the world. I was like, Jungle, you've been severely misinformed. And he goes, I don't care what you say, it must take an awful lot of courage to get up there. And I was just thinking, like, you know what takes an awful lot of courage? Risking your own life to save your best friends. And he goes, oh, come off it, mate, I've had it easy. And I was like, fuck you. If you've had it easy, what is my entire existence up until now? And he was a very humble old guy, but I made it my mission to at least get him to admit that he's had a very challenging life and he's done incredible to overcome it. And I was like, all right, correct me if I'm wrong, you told me earlier that you spent your entire 21st birthday in a freezing cold trench being ambushed by the Viet Cong. And he goes, yeah. And I lost a toe. And I was like, exactly. So you would be able to agree that your life has been much more difficult than mine. And he goes, right. Yeah. And he really waited up. And then he just goes, yeah, but fuck public speaking. Hey, mate. And I was like, no, you're right. I'm a hero. How do I do it? And then we started talking about my comedy, and he seemed super interested in it, just as interested in my life as I was with his. And he goes, well, what's your next show going to be about? And I hadn't started writing this show yet. And I was like, I don't know. And he goes, well, mate, if you don't know what your show's going to be about, maybe you could mention me quickly in one of your routines. And I was like, oh, I'd love to. And he goes, but I don't think I've given you enough material. And I was like, your name's Jungle. That's more than enough. And he goes, well, maybe you could compare our lives or something. Perhaps from our chat this evening, it seems we've both lived quite different lives. What an astute observation there from Jungle. And he's right. When he was 21, he was fighting for his country overseas in a war. When I was 21, one time I put deep heat on my asshole and I cried. For 2 hours. I was with my friends. That doesn't make it better, actually. One of them put it on their arm, the other one put it on their balls, and I'm competitive. And I don't like to talk about it. That's my Vietnam. But I did that stupid thing that you do in social situations where, you know when someone tells you a crazy story at a party and you feel that social pressure to kind of come back with something crazy you've done so they respect you? The problem was Jungle's been telling me true war stories for 5 hours where he's the main character, and I was sitting there all night oh, what's the craziest thing I've ever done? It gets to the very end and I just blurt out, one time I put deep heat on my hole and I cried. And I was like, oh my God, Luke, why did you say that? And Jungle just goes, oh, mate, that's fucked. And he has a real slow drink of his beer, and then he puts it down, and he's like, Even Jim would have been fazed by that, mate.